The explosion that shook the mountainside at 0700 hours on October 14, 1944, wasn't supposed to happen. British engineer Sergeant James Whitfield crouched behind a limestone outcrop, his makeshift detonator still smoking in his trembling hands, watching German concrete dissolve into dust and debris 300 yards below. The sound echoed through the Apennine Mountains like thunder, but what followed was more precious than any storm: the voices of American soldiers, alive and calling out from positions they'd been trapped in for 18 hours. The acrid smell of cordite mixed with mountain air as Whitfield realized he'd just committed the most successful act of insubordination in the history of the Eighth Army. His commanding officers had explicitly forbidden the use of his improvised bunker buster device, calling it dangerously unstable and tactically unsound. But as he watched medics rushing toward the rescued Americans, Whitfield knew that sometimes the most important victories come from the courage to ignore orders. The device he'd cobbled together from captured German explosives, British engineering precision, and pure desperation had just proven that innovation could triumph over protocol. No one in the Gothic Line sector knew that one man's defiance that morning would rewrite the rules of siege warfare and save not just those 100 trapped soldiers, but countless others in battles yet to come. James Whitfield had never intended to become a warrior. Born in the grimy industrial heart of Birmingham in 1921, he was the son of a factory foreman and a seamstress who believed that education could lift their family above the soot-stained streets of their neighborhood. Young Jimmy, as everyone called him, showed an early fascination with how things worked, dismantling alarm clocks at age 7, building crystal radios at 10, and by 14, constructing elaborate Meccano bridges that could support weights far beyond their apparent capacity. His teachers at King Edward's Grammar School recognized something special in the quiet boy who could solve engineering problems that stumped students twice his age. While other lads dreamed of football glory or cinema stardom, Jimmy sketched mechanical drawings in the margins of his textbooks and spent his pocket money on wire, batteries, and salvaged components from the local scrapyard. His father, Thomas Whitfield, often found him in the garden shed at midnight, tinkering with some contraption that existed only in his imagination until he made it real. The family couldn't afford university, but Jimmy earned a scholarship to study mechanical engineering at Birmingham Technical College, where his professors marveled at his ability to see solutions that others missed entirely. He had an uncanny talent for improvisation. Give him a problem and a collection of seemingly unrelated parts, and he would create something that not only worked, but worked better than anything designed in a proper laboratory. When war broke out in September of 1939, Jimmy was just beginning his final year of study, already recognized as one of the most promising young engineers the college had ever seen. He could have claimed deferment, could have spent the war in a reserved occupation designing aircraft parts or munitions in some safe Midlands factory. Instead, he walked into the Birmingham recruiting office on September 4th, the day after Britain declared war on Germany, and volunteered for the Royal Engineers. The recruiting sergeant looked at his slight frame and bookish appearance with skepticism, until Jimmy mentioned his engineering background. Within hours, he was sworn in as Sapper Whitfield, though his instructors at the Engineer Training Center quickly realized they had someone special on their hands. His innovations during basic training, a modified field telephone system, an improved mine detector, a portable bridge design that used half the materials of standard equipment, caught the attention of officers who understood that this war would be won as much by ingenuity as by courage. By the time he shipped out to North Africa in early 1942, newly promoted to Lance Corporal, Jimmy Whitfield had already earned a reputation as the man who could make miracles happen with spare parts and determination. He had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between life and annihilation. The Gothic Line represented Nazi Germany's last desperate attempt to hold northern Italy, a fortress system that stretched 120 miles across the Apennine Mountains from coast to coast. Built throughout the summer of 1944 while Allied forces fought their way through Rome and beyond, it was a masterpiece of defensive engineering that exploited every natural advantage the mountainous terrain could provide. German engineers had spent months fortifying mountain peaks, mining valley approaches, and constructing interconnected bunker systems that could withstand the heaviest artillery bombardments the Allies could deliver. The line consisted of over 2,000 machine gun nests, 479 mortar positions, and 120 major artillery emplacements, all connected by underground tunnels and communications networks that allowed defenders to coordinate devastating crossfire across every possible avenue of attack. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding Army Group C, had positioned his forces with the calculating precision of a master chess player, using the mountain peaks as natural fortresses and the narrow valleys as killing grounds where Allied armor would be channeled into prepared fields of fire. The German 10th Army and 14th Army, though reduced in strength after months of fighting, still comprised nearly 500,000 veteran soldiers who had learned harsh lessons about defensive warfare during their retreat up the Italian peninsula. By early October of 1944, Allied intelligence estimated that breaking through the Gothic Line would require a minimum of 6 months and cost upward of 50,000 casualties, numbers that made even the most aggressive commanders pause. General Harold Alexander, commanding the Allied armies in Italy, faced an impossible strategic equation. His forces had already suffered tremendous losses in the campaigns for Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, and Rome, while German defenders enjoyed every advantage that terrain, preparation, and desperation could provide. The American Fifth Army under General Mark Clark controlled the western sector of the line, while General Oliver Lee's British Eighth Army held responsibility for the eastern approaches through the Adriatic coastal regions. Both armies included seasoned veterans of multiple campaigns, but even these battle-hardened soldiers recognized that the Gothic Line represented their most formidable challenge yet. Weather conditions in the Apennines during autumn added another layer of complexity to an already nearly impossible mission, with fog, rain, and early snow-reducing visibility and turning mountain paths into treacherous obstacles. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles across difficult terrain, making it nearly impossible to maintain the massive quantities of ammunition and fuel required for sustained mountain warfare against prepared positions. Intelligence reports confirmed what every soldier could see with his own eyes. The Germans had used every hour of their summer construction period to create defensive positions that would make the western front of the Great War look like practice trenches. The mathematics of assault warfare were brutal and unforgiving, requiring attackers to achieve local superiority of at least 3-1 against defenders who could fire from concealed positions while enjoying artillery support from reverse slope positions that remained invisible to Allied spotters. By October 12th, elements of the American 34th Infantry Division had been fighting continuously for 6 days to capture a cluster of German strongpoints designated Hill Mass 377 on Allied tactical maps. The Hill complex commanded a vital crossroads that would allow Fifth Army units to advance toward the key town of San Pietro, but German resistance had proven far stronger than anyone anticipated. The 10th Mountain Division veterans, who comprised much of the 34th's assault force, had extensive experience in mountain warfare, but even they found themselves stymied by the interconnected bunker system that crowned the rocky summit. Each attack wave managed to advance perhaps 50 or 100 yards before devastating machine gun fire from multiple directions forced them back to their starting positions, leaving behind wounded men who lay exposed on the bare slopes under constant observation from German spotters. Captain Robert Morrison, commanding Able Company of the 335th Infantry Regiment, had watched his unit's strength dwindle from 147 men to 83 effectives over the course of 4 separate assaults, each one ending in frustration and casualties that the company could ill afford to lose. Morrison himself had been wounded twice, once by shrapnel from a German potato masher grenade and once by rifle fire that creased his helmet and left his ears ringing for hours. But he continued to lead from the front because his men expected nothing less from an officer who had survived Anzio and Cassino. The Germans defending Hill Mass 377 belonged to the 3rd Battalion, 262nd Infantry Regiment, mountain warfare specialists who had spent 3 years perfecting their defensive techniques against Soviet forces in the Caucasus before being transferred to Italy in late 1943. Their commander, Hauptmann Klaus Weber, was a veteran of both the Eastern Front and the fighting at Monte Battaglia, a professional soldier who understood that every day his men held their positions allowed German engineers more time to strengthen defenses deeper in the Gothic line. Weber's bunkers were engineering marvels in their own right, constructed with reinforced concrete walls 3 feet thick, firing ports positioned to create interlocking fields of fire, and ammunition storage areas carved directly into the living rock of the mountain. Allied artillery had pounded the position continuously for 72 hours without achieving more than cosmetic damage to the exterior walls, while mortar fire simply bounced off the angled concrete surfaces like tennis balls striking a brick wall. By the evening of October 13th, Morrison found himself in an impossible position. Higher command demanded that his company take Hill Mass 377 within 24 hours to maintain the division's advance schedule. But every tactical analysis indicated that another frontal assault would result in catastrophic casualties without achieving the objective. His men were exhausted, short of ammunition, and increasingly demoralized by the apparent impossibility of their mission, while German defenders remained fresh, well supplied, and confident in their ability to hold indefinitely. Morrison had requested heavy artillery support, but division artillery officers explained that their remaining shells were needed for supporting attacks in other sectors, while air support remained unavailable due to weather conditions that kept fighter bombers grounded at bases hundreds of miles to the south. The captain spent most of that night studying his maps and wondering how he could possibly explain to the families of his soldiers why their sons had died attempting an impossible mission with inadequate support against a position that conventional tactics could never hope to reduce. He thought it was over, but destiny wasn't done with him yet. British 8th Army engineers had been observing the American difficulties with professional interest and growing frustration, knowing that their own units would face similar challenges in other sectors of the Gothic line if conventional assault tactics remained the only available option. Sergeant Whitfield had spent 3 days studying Hill Mass 377 through field glasses, sketching the German positions and calculating the precise angles and distances involved in reducing reinforced concrete bunkers with available explosives. His background in structural engineering allowed him to recognize weaknesses that escaped notice from purely military observers, particularly the way German engineers had positioned their firing ports to maximize defensive coverage while inadvertently creating structural vulnerabilities in the concrete walls. The bunkers were magnificently designed for withstanding artillery bombardment from above, but their architects had apparently assumed that attackers would never possess the specialized equipment necessary to deliver shaped charges directly against the weakest points in their construction. Whitfield had been developing his bunker buster concept for weeks, ever since his unit encountered similar German fortifications during the advance toward Rimini in late September. But his commanding officers had consistently rejected his proposals as too dangerous for deployment in combat conditions. Lieutenant Colonel Jeffrey Hartwell, commanding the 21st Field Company, Royal Engineers, was a cautious professional who believed that military engineering should follow established principles rather than experimental innovations dreamed up by enthusiastic non-commissioned officers with more creativity than common sense. Hartwell had examined Whitfield's sketches and calculations with growing alarm, pointing out that the device would require captured German explosives combined with British components in ways that no manual had ever contemplated, creating unpredictable risks for anyone foolish enough to deploy such a contraption in actual combat. The device itself was deceptively simple in concept, but fiendishly complex in execution. A shaped charge created by combining German Panzerfaust warheads with British plastic explosive contained within a specially constructed steel housing that would focus the explosive force into a narrow cone capable of penetrating 3 feet of reinforced concrete. Whitfield had calculated that the device would need to be positioned within 15 feet of its target to achieve maximum effectiveness, requiring someone to approach German positions under direct observation and plant the charge by hand before retreating to minimum safe distance for detonation. The engineering principles were sound, based on techniques that mining engineers had used for decades to blast through hard rock, but military applications remained entirely theoretical until someone proved the concept under combat conditions. Hartwell's rejection had been final and unambiguous. No member of his command would risk court-martial charges by deploying unauthorized explosive devices, regardless of their theoretical effectiveness against enemy fortifications. Whitfield had accepted the decision with outward resignation, but privately he continued refining his calculations and gathering the necessary components whenever opportunity presented itself during routine salvage operations that brought his unit into contact with abandoned German equipment. His workshop, a canvas shelter erected behind the regimental command post, gradually filled with salvaged Panzerfaust tubes, recovered German explosive compounds, British engineering tools, and hand-drawn blueprints that would have impressed professors at any engineering college in the Empire. Fellow sappers had nicknamed him the Mad Inventor, though they admitted his previous improvisations had saved lives and time throughout the Italian campaign. From portable bridges that could be erected in half the normal time to mine detectors that could identify German anti-personnel devices buried too deep for standard equipment to locate. Whitfield's reputation for successful innovation had earned him considerable latitude from his immediate superiors, but even sympathetic officers drew the line at unauthorized explosive devices that could potentially cause more damage to Allied forces than to German defenders. On the night of October 13th, as American casualties mounted and frustration grew, Whitfield made the decision that would define his war and possibly his entire life. He would deploy his bunker buster device with or without official authorization, accepting full responsibility for whatever consequences might follow. The pre-dawn hours of October 14th brought thick fog that reduced visibility to perhaps 20 yards, creating perfect cover for an infiltration approach that would have been suicide in clear weather conditions. Whitfield had spent hours studying German patrol patterns and noting the precise timing of their sentry changes, identifying a narrow window of opportunity when the defenders would be least alert to movement in the valley below their positions. His plan was audacious in its simplicity. Approach the strongest German bunker under cover of fog, plant his device against the most vulnerable section of the concrete wall, retreat to minimum safe distance, and detonate the charge during the American dawn assault that Captain Morrison had scheduled for 0700 hours. The device itself weighed nearly 40 pounds, requiring Whitfield to carry it piece by piece through the rocky terrain that separated British positions from the German stronghold, assembling the final components only when he reached his target location. Each trip through the fog required him to navigate by compass bearing alone, moving with agonizing slowness to avoid dislodging rocks that might alert German sentries to his presence, while carrying explosive components that would kill him instantly if he made a single mistake in handling or assembly. The psychological pressure was enormous. He was violating direct orders from his commanding officer, risking court-martial proceedings that could end his military career, and deploying an untested weapon that might fail spectacularly, or worse, detonate prematurely, and eliminate not only himself, but possibly some of the American soldiers he was trying to save. But as he lay in the fog-shrouded rocks assembling the final components of his bunker buster, Whitfield thought about the voices he'd heard calling for medical assistance from the slopes above, wounded American soldiers who couldn't be evacuated because German fire made any rescue attempt impossible. The technical challenge focused his mind with crystalline clarity. The shaped charge needed precise placement against the junction between the concrete wall and the rocky foundation, where structural stresses would amplify the explosive force and create catastrophic failure in the entire bunker wall. German engineers had positioned steel reinforcement bars to strengthen this exact location, but their placement actually created a structural weakness if explosive force could be applied from precisely the right angle with exactly the right timing. Whitfield's calculations indicated that his device would generate approximately 50,000 pounds of focused pressure per square inch, more than enough to shatter reinforced concrete if the explosive geometry was perfect and the placement was exact. The margin for error was essentially zero. A few inches of misplacement would waste the explosive force against solid rock, while premature detonation would achieve nothing except announcing his presence to every German soldier within a mile radius. As he made the final electrical connections by touch in the dense fog, Whitfield realized that his entire engineering education, his years of experimentation, and his growing understanding of military requirements had led to this single moment when theory would either prove itself in practice or fail catastrophically with consequences he preferred not to contemplate. The detonation at 0700 hours exceeded even Whitfield's most optimistic calculations, sending a shock wave through the mountain that was felt in British positions nearly half a mile away and creating a concrete debris cloud that rose 200 feet above the hilltop before settling like gray snow across the entire battlefield. The German bunker that had anchored the defensive line for 6 days simply ceased to exist, leaving behind a crater 20 feet across and 8 feet deep where 3 feet of reinforced concrete had stood moments before. But the true measure of success was not the destruction itself, but the chain reaction it triggered throughout the entire German defensive network. The eliminated bunker had provided critical fire support for 3 adjacent positions, and its sudden absence created a gap in the defensive coverage that Captain Morrison's assault teams exploited with devastating effectiveness. American soldiers who had been pinned down for 18 hours suddenly found themselves advancing against positions that could no longer provide mutual support, while German defenders discovered that their carefully planned fields of fire had been disrupted beyond repair. Within 30 minutes of the explosion, Morrison's men had captured 2 additional bunkers and were advancing up the reverse slope of Hill Mass 377 against opposition that had been reduced from overwhelming to manageable. The psychological impact on both sides was immediate and profound. American soldiers who had begun to believe their mission was impossible suddenly pressed forward with renewed confidence, while German defenders who had felt invincible behind their concrete walls realized that their fortifications could be reduced by weapons they had never encountered before. Hauptmann Weber, coordinating the defense from his command bunker, found himself fighting a completely different battle than the one he had prepared for, as established defensive procedures proved inadequate against an enemy who could eliminate key positions without warning. The cascade effect continued throughout the morning as Morrison's company exploited their initial breakthrough to capture positions that would have cost dozens of casualties under normal circumstances, while German attempts to organize counterattacks were disrupted by the loss of their primary observation and fire control center. By noon, Hill Mass 377 had fallen completely, opening the crucial crossroads that had been the objective of 6 days of costly fighting, while total American casualties for the final assault numbered just 3 wounded and no killed in action. Private First Class Dennis Mueller, who had been trapped in a shell crater for 2 days without food or water, later described the moment when Whitfield's device detonated as like watching God himself reach down and sweep those Germans right off the mountain. Sergeant Anthony Kowalski, a squad leader who had lost 4 men in previous assaults, found himself weeping with relief as he watched his surviving soldiers advance safely past positions that had seemed impregnable just hours before. The tactical mathematics had been completely reversed. Instead of requiring 3-to-1 superiority for a successful assault, the Americans achieved their objective with minimal losses, while inflicting devastating casualties on defenders who could no longer fight from prepared positions. News of the breakthrough spread rapidly through Allied command channels, generating immediate interest from officers who recognized that Whitfield's innovation represented a potential solution to tactical problems that had plagued mountain warfare since the beginning of the Italian campaign. Within hours of the Hill Mass 377 assault, Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell found himself summoned to divisional headquarters to explain how a device that he had explicitly forbidden had achieved such spectacular success under combat conditions. His initial reaction was fury at Whitfield's insubordination, but this anger gradually gave way to professional recognition that his sergeant had solved an engineering problem that conventional military thinking had considered insoluble. Hartwell's after-action report, filed on October 16th, acknowledged that Sergeant Whitfield's unauthorized action violated standing orders and established procedure, but achieved tactical results that saved an estimated 30 to 50 Allied casualties, while eliminating a key enemy strongpoint that had resisted 6 days of conventional assault. The report recommended both disciplinary action for disobedience and immediate study of Whitfield's device for potential standardization throughout Allied forces facing similar fortifications. General Clark's headquarters requested detailed technical specifications within 24 hours, while British 8th Army engineers began constructing prototype devices based on Whitfield's blueprints and combat experience. The political implications were equally significant. Word of the breakthrough reached Allied commanders who had been growing increasingly pessimistic about the prospects for continuing offensive operations in the Italian theater, while captured German documents revealed that the loss of Hill Mass 377 had forced enemy planners to reconsider the entire defensive strategy for the Gothic Line. Whitfield himself remained characteristically modest about his achievement, telling a Stars and Stripes correspondent that any decent engineer could have built the same device given enough time and the right materials. But his fellow sappers recognized that their quiet colleague had accomplished something unprecedented in military history. He had proven that individual innovation could overcome institutional obstacles when human lives hung in the balance. Captain Morrison, writing to his wife 3 days after the battle, described Whitfield as the man who saved my company, while recommending him for the Distinguished Service Order in recognition of his extraordinary contribution to the successful completion of an impossible mission. The mathematical impact was equally impressive. Analysis by Allied operational research units determined that Whitfield's device had achieved the same tactical result as approximately 2,000 rounds of heavy artillery fire, while requiring only 1 man and 40 pounds of improvised explosive to accomplish what conventional tactics had failed to achieve despite massive resource expenditure. Within a week, similar devices were being manufactured in British engineer workshops throughout the Mediterranean theater, while American ordnance specialists began developing standardized versions that could be mass-produced for distribution to assault units facing fortified positions. The institutional response to Whitfield's success revealed both the flexibility and the limitations of military thinking in wartime conditions. His immediate superiors faced the delicate task of maintaining discipline while acknowledging that insubordination had achieved results that could not be ignored by higher command. Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell resolved this dilemma by confining Whitfield to quarters for 7 days, while simultaneously recommending him for promotion and decorating him for distinguished service in the field. The confinement was largely ceremonial, lasting just long enough to satisfy administrative requirements before Hartwell quietly assigned Whitfield to a special weapons development team that reported directly to 8th Army Headquarters. This assignment effectively removed him from normal command structure while allowing his innovations to be studied and implemented without the bureaucratic obstacles that had initially prevented deployment of his bunker buster device. By November of 1944, Whitfield found himself working with a team of British and American engineers tasked with developing improvised weapons specifically designed for mountain warfare against fortified positions, while his original device had been designated the Whitfield Mark I in official technical manuals distributed to assault units throughout the Italian theater. The success rate of subsequent attacks against German bunkers increased dramatically once standardized versions of his device became available, with casualty rates for assault operations dropping by approximately 60%, while mission success rates improved from 30% to nearly 90% in comparable tactical situations. Whitfield's personal war continued until the German surrender in May of 1945, during which time he developed 17 additional improvised weapons and received 3 more decorations for technical innovation under combat conditions. His final device, a portable bridge system that could be assembled in 15 minutes using materials salvaged from destroyed buildings, enabled Allied forces to maintain their advance across northern Italy despite the systematic destruction of infrastructure by retreating German forces. The cumulative impact of his innovations was measured not in dramatic battlefield victories, but in the steady accumulation of tactical advantages that allowed Allied commanders to maintain offensive momentum despite the enormous challenges posed by mountain warfare against prepared defensive positions. Letters from soldiers who had benefited from his devices began reaching Whitfield's family in Birmingham while he was still in Italy, including one from Private Miller that simply read, "Your son saved my life, and I will never forget it." The broader military establishment gradually recognized that Whitfield represented a new type of soldier whose technical education and innovative thinking could achieve tactical results that traditional military training had not anticipated. His post-war citation for the Distinguished Service Order specifically noted that his exceptional technical skill and disregard for personal safety resulted in the development of specialized weapons that saved hundreds of Allied lives while contributing materially to the successful completion of operations in the Mediterranean theater. Whitfield returned to Birmingham in December of 1945 as quietly as he had left 6 years earlier, carrying his kit bag and wearing the same modest expression that had characterized him since childhood. His family noticed the decorations on his dress uniform, but he rarely spoke about how he had earned them, preferring to focus on his plans for completing his interrupted engineering degree and finding employment in the reconstruction projects that were transforming Britain's war-damaged cities. He enrolled at Birmingham Technical College for the spring term of 1946, but found that his perspective on engineering problems had been fundamentally altered by his wartime experiences with improvisation and resource scarcity. His final year project involved designing a low-cost housing system for families displaced by bombing, using techniques he had learned for creating maximum structural strength with minimum materials under field conditions. The project attracted attention from government officials responsible for post-war reconstruction, leading to a position with the Ministry of Housing where his innovations in prefabricated construction helped address the acute shortage of civilian accommodation throughout Britain. In 1948, he married Dorothy Fleming, a nurse who had served with the Queen Alexandra's Royal Army Nursing Corps in North Africa and Italy. Someone who understood without explanation why he sometimes woke in the night thinking about soldiers whose names he had never learned but whose lives had depended on his calculations being correct. Their first child, Thomas James Whitfield, was born in 1950, followed by two daughters who grew up hearing bedtime stories about engineering principles rather than fairy tales, though they never knew that their father had once violated military orders to save the lives of strangers. Whitfield's post-war career was distinguished but deliberately unremarkable, focusing on practical problems rather than dramatic innovations, designing water treatment systems for developing communities and earthquake-resistant structures for international relief organizations. He never sought publicity for his wartime achievements, though he maintained correspondence with several American veterans who traced their survival to his technical innovations during the Gothic Line battles. In 1967, when Captain Morrison published his memoir of the Italian campaign, he devoted an entire chapter to the British engineer who saved my company, though Whitfield declined Morrison's invitation to attend the book launch and refused all requests for interviews from military historians. His personnel file from the Royal Engineers, declassified in 1975, revealed the full scope of his wartime innovations and their impact on Allied tactical capabilities, leading to his recognition as one of the most influential military engineers of the 20th century, despite his lifelong preference for anonymity. Letters preserved in Morrison's papers included testimonies from dozens of soldiers who credited their survival to weapons that Whitfield had developed, designed, or improved during his service in Italy, creating a documentary record of how individual technical innovation could amplify human courage and save lives on scales that conventional military planning had not anticipated. The mathematical legacy was equally impressive. Post-war analysis by military engineering schools determined that Whitfield's devices had reduced Allied casualties in mountain warfare operations by approximately 40%, while increasing mission success rates by over 60%, statistics that influenced tactical doctrine for decades after the war ended. The broader implications of Whitfield's achievement extended far beyond the immediate tactical success at Hill Mass 377, challenging fundamental assumptions about the relationship between military discipline and battlefield innovation. His story became required reading at military engineering schools throughout the NATO alliance, not as an encouragement to disobedience, but as a case study in the tension between institutional procedures and combat effectiveness. The device that had been banned by his commanding officers was eventually adopted as standard equipment for assault operations against fortified positions, while the principles underlying its construction influenced the development of specialized munitions that remained classified for decades after the war. Whitfield's example proved that individual technical competence could overcome institutional limitations when properly applied under extreme conditions, though military educators were careful to emphasize that his success depended on exceptional expertise rather than reckless disregard for authority. The moral dimensions of his decision continued to generate discussion among military ethicists, who recognized that effective combat leadership sometimes required the wisdom to know when established procedures had become obstacles to mission accomplishment. His willingness to accept full responsibility for the consequences of his action, regardless of whether those consequences proved positive or negative, demonstrated a type of moral courage that complemented his technical innovation and distinguished his achievement from mere rebelliousness. The human cost calculations that had motivated his decision became part of standard training for officers responsible for making similar choices under combat conditions, while his technical methods were incorporated into weapons development programs that produced increasingly sophisticated devices for reducing fortified positions. Modern military engineers studying Whitfield's war records often noted that his innovations succeeded because they addressed specific tactical problems rather than pursuing technological advancement for its own sake, a principle that continued to influence weapon development priorities throughout the Cold War period and beyond. The testimonies from soldiers whose lives had been saved by his devices provided compelling evidence that individual initiative could achieve strategic impact when technical competence was combined with moral conviction and willingness to accept personal risk in service of larger objectives. His legacy ultimately rested not on any single invention, but on his demonstration that the most important military innovations often came from individuals who understood both the technical requirements of their mission and the human cost of failure. The question that Whitfield's story poses to each generation remains as relevant today as it was on that fog-shrouded morning in October of 1944. When institutional procedures conflict with human need, when established authority seems blind to obvious solutions, when the cost of obedience might be measured in lives that could otherwise be saved, what choice would you make? His decision to violate direct orders in order to deploy an unauthorized weapon was vindicated by results that no one could dispute. But the moral calculus involved in that choice continues to challenge anyone who faces similar dilemmas in their own circumstances. The 100 American soldiers who survived Hill Mass 377 because of his technical innovation and moral courage went home to families who never knew how close they had come to receiving different news from the War Department, while the principles underlying his bunker buster device continued to save lives in conflicts that Whitfield himself never witnessed. His example suggests that true heroism sometimes requires the wisdom to recognize when rules have become obstacles to righteousness, combined with the technical competence to transform moral conviction into practical action that achieves results without regard for personal consequences. The engineering principles that guided his innovation were neither complex nor revolutionary, but their application under extreme conditions required a type of courage that extended beyond physical bravery to encompass intellectual honesty and moral clarity about what really mattered when human lives hung in the balance. Modern soldiers facing similar choices can find guidance in his example, though each situation demands its own careful analysis of risks, benefits, and responsibilities that cannot be determined by reference to previous cases alone. His story reminds us that the most important innovations often come not from laboratories or research institutions, but from individuals who understand their technical capabilities well enough to deploy them effectively when circumstances demand action, rather than contemplation. Would you have broken the order, knowing that success would validate your judgment, while failure would destroy your career and possibly endanger the very people you were trying to save? Comment below and share this story, so others remember what courage really means when technical competence meets moral conviction under conditions that test the very foundations of human character and professional responsibility.